welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. As you all know, business cases shape the way that future leaders see leadership, but too often women are left out of these narratives. So today we are going to talk about why female representation matters so much. And to do that, we have an expert. Here today with us is Colleen Sharen. Colleen is an associate professor at Western University. She's an award-winning case writer whose work has been recognized multiple times, including the Best Case Awards in 2003 and this year, 2025. Colleen's research focuses on how women are represented in business case studies, and she's also published several cases and articles on the subject. So you can Google her, you'll find great information. Most recently, she co-authored a paper proposing changes to how we write cases to make cases feel more inclusive. As I said, Colleen is an associate professor at the Department of Management and Organizational Studies at Western University, and we are so thrilled to have her with us today. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so now I'm going to do the thing that confuses everybody, and that is try to share this thing properly. Okay, so today we're going to focus in on some of the research that allows us to understand why does this matter. So we're going to look at 3 learning outcomes. The first is to explain why the representation of women in cases actually matters. The second is to describe how women are represented in teaching cases. And the third is to identify ways that we can make change in case writing and case learning. So our first question, why does it matter? Well, what we know about management education is it socializes undergraduate and graduate students in the appropriate roles, beliefs, and behaviors for managers. In other words, we're teaching them how to be and enact a certain kind of role. And manager is a formal title or a legitimate source of power, the formal role that you play. So it also teaches students who and what leaders are. One of the reasons this is so important is that we know, at least among undergraduate students, that between first and fourth year of an undergraduate business degree, the associations that female students make between being female and being a manager or a leader declines. At the same time, during that same 4-year period, associations between women and manager or leader do not exist among male students, male undergraduate students, and they do not change over that 4-year period of time. So it's clear that there's some stuff that we're not doing that we need to be doing. So why do we need women in cases in management education? Well, first of all, we know from about 30 years worth of studies, the role models are important for women, especially, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Men are less likely to have female role models, which is also important because that means they're less likely to see women in positions of power and see that as normal and see that as appropriate. Pedagogical materials, so learning materials, provide distant role models. So we may not know this individual, but by merely seeing them in a specific kind of role, we are providing a type of role model. Absence of women or portrayals of stereotypes about women discourage women from aspiring to management and to leadership. So what do we know about representation of cases? So this comes from a paper that Rosemary McGowan and I co-authored and published in 2019 in the Journal of Management Education. And the first thing is, let's start out with the facts. Harvard showed that they had about 11 or 12% of their cases at roughly the same time had female protagonists. What we did was we pulled out Ivey branded cases in 2014. So it's the full year ending August 2014. 19% of all cases published by Ivey in the Ivey branded cases featured female protagonists. And 6% of the best-selling cases featured female protagonists. So clearly, women are far underrepresented relative to their presence in leadership roles in the workplace. Female views. So what we did was we looked at all of these 51 cases that were in this time period, and we matched them to male cases featuring male protagonists during that same time period. And what we found was there were fewer quotes from female protagonists. The quotes were half the length of quotes from male protagonists. And the description of female characters were also half the length of the description of male characters. So right there, what you're seeing is even if the woman is the protagonist of the case, she is far less present in the case, and her leadership is far less present. So then we started to look at different ways that women were described or represented. They were described as having less legitimate or positional power and less expert power than were the men in the male cases. They were represented as less strategic or visionary, innovative or creative, less passionate, or, less rational or evidence-based, credible, agentic or meaning active, taking action, and less certain. All of these different things are consistent with stereotypes that we have about women that justify why women aren't leaders. They were also described as being more emotional, cautious, detail-oriented, overwhelmed, aggressive, and risk-averse. So again, what we're seeing is a set of now negative behaviors that are ascribed to women, and they are more often ascribed to women than they are ascribed to men. So the question then becomes, well, we kind of know what the picture looks like. There have been a couple of other studies. Some Harvard researchers have done the same thing and found similar data. So the question then becomes, how do we make change? Well, as case writers, something that we need to think about is bias. And one of the bias is the halo or horn effect. So essentially, that means taking either one positive or negative characteristic of an individual and having that single characteristic color the entire picture of who that person is, rather than providing kind of a balanced perception of that position. So things that you might see is a character who is constantly portrayed as being anxious or worried. That would be a horns type of characteristic. And that covers all of the description. It colors everything that we see about the female lead. The other thing that we want to think about, and this is something in my early case writing career I did a lot of, and that was kind of inferring certain kinds of behaviors. So when somebody hinted that they were anxious about something, I would ascribe that feeling to them, even though they didn't really say it. And so one of the things you need to think about when you're looking at your interviews and you're writing a case and you've got a transcription of an interview is that you're not inferring some stereotypical characteristic or behavior onto a character because they're female or because they're male or they're from some other group. And so it's really important to kind of ask yourself, did this person really say that, or am I inferring it? Another thing that I think is really crucial, and we noticed a lot of this in the cases, women were described in certain ways, for example, detail-oriented. The implication is she's in the weeds, she lacks vision, she lacks those senior leader qualities. And instead, kind of thinking about, well, is there another way I can communicate this? Can I say that it was really important to her to ensure quality, which has a different tone and feeling to it than being detail oriented? Another word we see a lot in cases is so and so wondered. And it was very interesting because women got hit with the wondered quite a bit more than men did. The implication is she's uncertain or she lacks confidence. So when you're introducing, here are the four options, you could use the word thought instead of wondered. Thought that there might be three options, or thought that this might be a solution, rather than wondered if this was a solution. And finally, descriptions, it doesn't have to be the word overwhelmed, but descriptions of the protagonist as being unable to cope are really important to get rid of. Using words like so and so was challenged has the same kind of feeling, but it has the same kind of intent, but it doesn't imply that the character can't cope. So those are some things to think about in case writing. Finally, some things if you're an instructor to think about when you're doing your course planning. Select cases featuring women decision makers. So try to get to that 50-50. If you can't, because those cases aren't available or they're not covering all the topics you want, you can also do things like host female guest speakers or use media profiles of female executives as a way to kind of amplify the presence of female leaders in the classroom. The other thing that you can do is you can select cases that represent women in less stereotyped ways. So be on the lookout for some of those stereotypical portrayals that we talked about. So that's my advice to all of you. Here I go. We can't hear you, Laura.
There you go. So sorry. Thank you, Colleen. That was wonderful. Great insights. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome my colleague, Violetta Gallagher. Violetta is the Associate Director of Product and Publishing at Ivey Publishing, where she leads the fantastic team that day after day publishes the wonderful cases that we hope now will be more inclusive. So Violetta will moderate this conversation, the second part of the conversation with Colleen, and she has some questions for her.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Colleen, for sharing your research. And really building on the findings of this research, we've taken on proactive steps to reduce the negative impact of stereotypical or limited portrayals of women in business cases. We still have lots of work left, but we've definitely listened to the research that you had put out. We've worked closely with editors and our authors to really think about, how are we examining, how are we critically assessing females and how are they described, and ensuring that there's more of a nuanced and empowering representation of those females. So of those cases that were identified, we went back, had the conversations, and since then, when a case looks at goes through our editing process, we keep that in the same practice. And additionally, since then, we've implemented DEI tagging, so capturing dimensions such as gender, race, and more to help track and improve representation across our case collection. And there will be more to come there, and we will look forward to really re-examine and see have we shifted and made impact here. But Colleen, really, I'd love to unpack this a bit more. And again, thank you for sharing the research. So let's begin with, the beginning. What led you to explore gender representation in business cases?
I was at a conference many years ago now, and I'd gone to a presentation. Someone had done a study of the representation of women in organizational behavior textbooks. And I got talking with one of the people in the audience who I'd met a few times before, Rosemary McGowan, and she and I started talking about cases. And both of us kind of said, well, you know what? we think there's a problem here, but we have no evidence that there's a problem here. And that's what began a 5-year project to get this study published.
That's wonderful. And you and your co-author talk about the hidden curriculum in business education. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So, the hidden curriculum is the unstated assumptions about how the world works. And so they are the unstated things like you wear a suit to a job interview. Nobody tells you you have to wear a suit, or you wear a suit to a big corporate presentation. It's not explicit, it is implicit, it is assumed. You get dinged if you don't follow the rule. And interestingly enough, we assume everybody knows these rules. And so they are taught in ways that are not anywhere on the course outline. They are assumed. And so historically, the assumption is that men are leaders and women are followers. And there's still some significant research published in the last 5 years that shows to at least some degree, we still see women as the ideal followers and men as the ideal leaders. And so that hidden curriculum is who fits in what role.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was dressing for my date today, I thought I will not wear a suit specifically for that reason. So let's talk a little bit about the data. What does the data tell us about who gets to lead in these stories?
Well, it's interesting because I'm not sure that the data can tell us everything here. So, one of the challenges is that the authors who are writing the cases are the ones who are selecting what to write about. And so, it may be that there are lots of women in senior leadership roles within corporations, but the people who are writing the cases don't know they exist or choose not to write about them for some reason. So part of it is the author's selection process. Part of it is whoever is authoring, they have a network of people that they can reach out to find case leads. And so if that network doesn't have a lot of senior women in it, senior leaders, female leaders in it, it's more difficult to write cases. And secondary source cases, those cases that come from the news, interestingly enough, there's a fair amount of literature that shows that women are less likely to claim that they are an expert in something, and less likely to be featured in news. They tend to be more kind of in the background. And as a result, a lot of what's published in the media about women leaders, other than female political leaders, there's just not a lot to write about. You need a fair amount of information to write a secondary source case. So it's not clear. I think there's been some change over the last 10 years since we published this case or this study, but how much is difficult to know.
I would agree. In the last 10 years, you can start seeing that shift, but I don't know if it's really made that much of an impact yet. And often, when talking to authors, if they're just starting their writing journey, really encouraging to look at, yes, you're interviewing this CEO or this individual, but is there female representation that you can speak to them about how that situation went and use them as a protagonist? And so it does begin with that writing process and who you choose to have as your protagonist.
Yeah.
So the title of your paper is powerful, invisible or cliched. Can you explain what that means in the context of business cases?
Well, one of the interesting things about visibility is that you have to be seen to be accepted. When Barack Obama's administration captured bin Laden, for example, they released a picture in the Situation Room featuring 3 women, including Hillary Clinton, in the Situation Room. And several conservative newspapers in the United States airbrushed the women out. And so this idea of invisibility, if you're not seen to be there, you're not seen to be making decisions. You're not seen to be fulfilling the role as a leader. And so when we look at, for instance, the Ivey branded collection 10 years ago, about 20% of the cases roughly featured female protagonists. Interestingly enough, there were certain areas like finance and IT where there were far fewer female protagonists. And so it varies by discipline quite a bit. HR, you're going to get a lot more women protagonists than you are, say, in finance. And that is problematic because that creates further barriers to women seeing themselves as leaders in the finance industry. So the invisibility thing is really crucial. The other piece of the puzzle is that in many ways, the stereotypes that are represented in the cases are just that, stereotypes. Women are seen as anxious and worried and fretful and in the weeds, not visionary. And all of that stuff came really strongly through that it was a cliche. And it didn't, the cases didn't represent women as well-rounded people with maybe some more agentic behaviors or action-based behaviors. We tended to want, what we know about stereotypes is we want people to completely perfectly fit the stereotype. And so we, as authors, tend to cut out the pieces that don't fit the stereotypes. And so this becomes a real challenge as an author because I know my first few cases were loaded with this stuff. It was only when I started to do the research and started to read all these cases and look for this stuff that I found it. Another thing that was not mentioned in the paper because we only looked at cases, but should be in the teaching notes, is that often cases make the assumption that the way to fix the problem of representation of women in senior management roles is to fix women. So change them so they behave like men. Yes. We know that that doesn't work. If women behave too much in an agentic masculine way, they get labeled as aggressive and unlikable. And so one of the things to be careful about as an author is to be thinking about what kinds of messages am I sending in my analysis that could be problematic? And, am I thinking about these kind of fix the woman solutions in a critical light?
And I think so often we forget about the teaching note and the impact that the teaching note has. And it's not just about the case and the representation and what the student will read, but how it's taught. So they may prepare for that classroom and read a strong woman and strong female leadership, but then come to the classroom and be taught something very different, depending on how that's being sent. So, and we're going to be speaking to students after this, and so I'm looking really forward to that and connecting it back. So, talking a little bit more about impact here, what impact does this have on students' learning and expectations and confidence, do you think?
Well, we don't have a lot of hard data on that, but we do have some decent data on women and role models. So we do know that women report wanting and needing to see role models who are like themselves. And that includes women of color and people with disabilities. There are all kinds of lacks of role models. And so if you don't see yourself within the case, you start to lose your confidence that you can become the leader. And so I think that's the big impact. But I also think it's important to think about the impact on young men. So we know over the last 10 years, young men have become more conservative in their outlooks. Not all young men, but in general. And they see the world as a threat. So seeing women in role models as leader role models hopefully will normalize the idea that women are equally effective as men. And I think that's as important as the effect it has on young women.
Absolutely. And a mother with two boys, I cannot agree more. So, Colleen, what's the alternative? What would a more inclusive case collection look like to you?
Well, I think a more inclusive case collection would involve um, getting to that magic 50% mark and really starting to work with authors across all of the different disciplines within business. Certainly, I write a lot of nonprofit cases. It's no problem for me to find female leaders in the nonprofit sector. It's working with people in finance and IT and marketing to get them to engage with it. And there's a lot of resistance to that. I have a really great colleague. I've worked with him lots before. And whenever this comes up, he's like, well, but I teach marketing. I don't teach OB. I don't teach DEI. So how, I can't really talk about that because that's not my discipline. And the argument that I try to make to people is that representation, not only of women, but of all marginalized people, is really important, even if it's just representation that a person with a disability can still be a leader and can be represented as capable and strong. And you don't have to necessarily even talk about it in the teaching note, unless perhaps there was some reason why their marginalization had an impact on their ability to get the job done, right? To achieve the recommendation or to convince others that that recommendation was legitimate. But I think the starting point is to figure out a way how we represent people's social identities beyond pronouns.
Can't agree more. Thank you so much, Colleen, for sharing that information. And we'll hear from Colleen in terms of takeaways near the end, and I'll send it back to Laura right now.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We have great feedback in the chat. So keep sending your messages, keep sending. You can also start sending your questions for the Q&A session at the end, and we will make sure to address them. Now, we want to flip the conversation a little bit. And instead of discussing the instructor case author perspective, we want to flip it to the student perspective. And for that, we welcome two special guests. I will let them introduce themselves, but they are business students and they are learning with cases, and they will share their perspective in terms of representation and why it matters to them and their whole generation, because they're here representing a whole generation of business students. And Violetta will be moderating that conversation as well. So can you please introduce yourselves?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. I can go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Sachkir Chahal, and like Laura said, I'm a business student at Ivey. I'm entering my fourth year this September. I wanted to participate in this seminar because I am someone who has been lucky to have been surrounded by a lot of women in leadership positions, and that's definitely influenced my decision to pursue business and even attempt leadership roles. And so I understand the importance of having that representation and just being a part of this conversation.
Hi, my name is Crystal. So like Sachkira, I've been very fortunate to have been surrounded by a lot of female leaders. For me, I'm entering HBA 2 and next year we're going on exchange. So it'll be nice to see how women leadership presents itself in other countries and geographies as well. But for me, the main reason why I joined this panel was because I was very fortunate to be a part of the Women in Asset Management program. And there I did have a lot of interactions with outstanding female leaders. So again, it's a big kind of, there's a lot to be done about it, but I think there's a lot that we have done about it, and that manifests in the Women in Asset Management program. So I'm excited to speak about this.
And Crystal, you'll be that contact for Colleen in the future for accounting cases. Jumping right into this. So I'll start maybe with you, Crystal. How has case-based learning shaped how you think about leadership?
Well, case-based learning definitely has shaped a certain stereotype that I have about leadership. Obviously, we see across many cases that there are more men in business fields, especially in courses that I've taken, such as FinFun or operations. We tend to see more women in cases presented in more like communications or more of these kind of softer skilled jobs. And again, that does send a certain message forward that may not be intended to be sent in the first place. Again, leadership in cases really matters because it's not about, again, what Colleen shared about explicit versus implicit. It's not just about what's explicitly stated, but the implicit message it sends to those reading the case, even if the woman in the case itself doesn't present any aggressiveness or any form of just the matter of fact of that woman being a leader in a communications case versus an operations case. That says a lot about women in cases.
I can't agree more, Crystal and Zakir. Same question for you here. How has case-based learning shaped how you think about leadership?
Yeah, so case-based learning for me, I think it has helped me see leadership as more of a dynamic skill rather than a fixed trait. I think before starting my journey at Ivey, myself and so many of my peers, often when we thought of leadership, we thought of it as something, you either are born a leader or you're not. It's something you either have or it's something you don't. And through the case method and through lots of conversations, specifically in our LPO class, we learned, leadership isn't something that you either have or you don't have. It's a set of skills that make you a leader. But I think with that comes, what skills are we sort of associating with leadership, and how are these skills associated or traits associated with specific just genders or gender stereotypes. So that's sort of where the conflict comes. It's okay, we have that understanding that leadership is more complex, but it's important to sort of make that distinction in terms of, what traits are we associating with leadership, and what does that mean in terms of what we think of when we think of a leader.
And if I can almost say, to wrap up the two thoughts, is there a gap in the pedagogy or in the way that you're describing this, that, there's lack of female representation in certain disciplines, as Colleen had shared with us and as you both had brought up, but then also around leadership and definition around leadership. And that's very interesting. I'll start with you, Zakira. How have you noticed gaps or stereotypes in the cases that you study?
I would say yes, I definitely have noticed. Many cases, they still would, I would say, reflect a limited view in terms of who holds power in business. The majority of our cases have male protagonists. And of course, while these cases are valuable and, we're learning something, whether it's a finance course or an operations course, I think the lack of broader representation, it can subtly reinforce stereotypes about who we see as sort of natural leaders. And something that Colleen actually sort of touched on before, something that would often happen in our classroom is when we would be discussing a hypothetical situation where we have a hypothetical leader, I think many of my classmates naturally sort of would just use he as a pronoun, if we're discussing a CEO. And so it's just little stuff like that you don't really think is making a difference. But I definitely do think, if we had more female protagonists, this wouldn't be such a common thing that so many students do.
Absolutely. And Colleen had mentioned that too, right? And it's almost beyond that pronoun and not just having he or she, but more of that. So, Crystal, have you noticed gaps or stereotypes in the cases that you've studied?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one prominent example I can pull straight from an operations class I took. It's more of a double-edged sword where it's nice to see women represented in a very relatable way. So the case I'm highlighting is Ani Jewelers. It's about a woman who owns a jewelry shop. And obviously, as a woman, I love jewelry. I think it's so great that, we're incorporating jewelry and manufacturing together. However, what I noticed about that case was that instead that woman was a leader, the CEO or the founder was a leader, and she relied heavily on her family to help her with kind of running the business. She relied on her son to help her with accounting. And I think that definitely sends the message, even if it's not, again, explicit, that, maybe we can't do accounting by ourselves. But it really is interesting that even though I relate so heavily, and I'm really appreciative that the author incorporated the idea of family and jewelry into a case about women, it was one of the only cases in operations we had about a woman. So I think just broadening that scope would really help bridge that gap. But it is something that I do see often.
Absolutely. And Colleen and I, before this webinar, also spoke to that, how, women are always supported by the family. It's never a woman coming in and having all of that, responsibility and leadership. She's supported by someone. And you just proved exactly that. So, Crystal, over to you. How does seeing or not seeing, and I think you touched a little bit on this, how does seeing or not seeing women in leadership roles affect you?
Well, I'm very fortunate to be surrounded by outstanding, again, female figures, especially where I'm working now in finance. Our CEO happens to be a Japanese woman, which you don't see very often, especially here in Canada. And she's in a very high position, but she does get a lot of criticism because, again, like with a lot of power as a woman comes obviously criticism. But I do think that it has affected me in the sense that, again, Colleen has mentioned the point about aggressiveness, that women don't want to be seen as coming off as aggressive. But I do think that, agreeing with Colleen as well on that point, I think it also might be an advantage for women to use the skills that maybe are kind of directed towards them in a passive aggressive way to their advantage. So, for example, being more, again, as you mentioned, supported by family, supported by the colleagues to I'm kind of rambling now, but honing in on those skills that maybe would be seen as more feminine in nature would actually help, women succeed as well. And this is something I've seen our CEO do very well. So that's also taught me that I don't have to try to act like a man to be good. I can just be a woman and still be very powerful.
That's very empowering and wonderful to hear. How does seeing or not seeing women in leadership roles affect you?
Yeah, I think honestly, Crystal hit the nail on the coffin with that answer. But honestly, it definitely has an impact. Seeing women leading authentically and decisively in cases, it's very empowering. And I think for me and a lot of other women who are, interested in pursuing a leadership role in the future, and potentially working in a typically male-dominated industry, it reinforces the idea that, we belong in these spaces too, and there's not a specific mold in terms of what a leader looks like. I think one of the cases that I always go back to, it's one of the more recent cases we had done, dough TO. It was about a cookie dough shop that was run by a woman. And I think one thing that definitely stood out about that case to me was when we discussed, the way that she chose to run her business, and all this creativity she had towards growth. When we discussed her as a leader, I remember that discussion specifically, all the traits we sort of touched on, or all the sort of ways she was improving. It was a very gender neutral conversation. And I think that stuck out to me because, I saw her and I saw the way that she was able to sort of build something she was so passionate about. And it just, again, it motivated me, and it helped me understand that, I can still be myself while also being a leader. Sort of like what Crystal said, I don't have to change who I am to do what I want to do. Those two can sort of coexist. And I think that's very important for women to understand.
And I am thrilled to hear this from a generation that is just stepping into a very, many opportunities, and hearing that, being authentic, having that, coming to roles where you can feel empowered, where you can, make that change within the way that the organizations really look at female leaders is very exciting. And it does start with, the case writing, and then also teaching and seeing it in the classroom. But yet, how do you then take that and make it better, right? And we have lots of work to do as a publisher, but yet it is very, very exciting to hear yet what you're taking from this. So thank you both.
Wonderful. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights from the classroom. Now we want to invite Colleen back to the spotlight, and you stay right where you are so we can discuss some final insights, some final comments about what we've discussed.
So this is my favorite part, because we really get to take everything that we've spoken about, and I'm going to ask the challenging question of what's that one takeaway or challenge you'd like to leave your audience with? And we'll start with you, Crystal.
Oh, sorry. I think I cut out a bit at the end. Do you mind just repeating the last part?
No, of course not. So what's that one takeaway or challenge you'd like to leave with the audience?
I think one challenge would just to be just taking that first step and leaving our own implicit biases behind. And even as women, we house these biases very often, and that comes in the way of our work. I see myself apologizing a lot during my work. And again, this is a very feminine trait almost, especially in finance. So just leaving those behind allows us to take a step forward as a whole, as kind of female workers in this new generation.
Wonderful. And for you, Zakir, what's that one takeaway or challenge you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff about this being mentioned, Chad, and I think I'll highlight it. Authentic leadership. So, how can we are sort of the leaders, and the actions we do will sort of lead the next generation and mold how the next generation sees leaders, as well as this generation. And I think on that note, how can we all be authentic leaders? How can we make sure that when we are in leadership positions that, we are culminating ourselves and our passion without reinforcing certain stereotypes? And how can we sort of stop doing that if, we find ourselves sort of changing who we are to fit into leadership roles, I think is what I'll challenge you guys with.
Love it. And Colleen, what's the one takeaway or challenge you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I would really encourage any of the case writers in the audience to write and submit a case to the Ivey case competition that's coming up, that's focused on finding more cases about women leaders.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you all. It's been a great conversation. You will be here for a Q&A. Laura's just going to fill us in a little bit on that information about the case competition.
Absolutely. So we are proud and happy to share that submissions to the case competitions open on this Sunday, June 1st. So we are ready to receive your cases. We are very, very excited to add to our overall catalog. And I also want to share that this is only the first of a two-part webinar series, let's call it series, that we're doing to support this case competition. So the next webinar will be more focused on writing to help you, to support you to submit those winning cases, those winning submissions to the case competition. So if you're interested in submitting, don't miss the next webinar. We will have more information available soon. So please stay tuned on social media. Also on social media, you will find videos from Crystal and Shakira on talking about female representation in cases. And so there's a lot of information there. Please don't miss it. And now we have lots of questions for our Q&A, Violeta. So let's get started. The questions, I will read the questions, and any person that wants to answer can go ahead and do so. If it's regarding publishing or submissions, Violeta will take the lead, of course. And if not, then any of you can, Colleen, absolutely, you can take the lead. So the first one is from Maria Ballesteros Sola. And she says, have you included in your study the author's genders? Or otherwise, do men tend to write cases with men as protagonists? Have the fewer with female protagonists been written by females? I am just trying to understand why before this lack of representation. The why. Okay, thank you, she says.
Oh, okay, well, I'll take a stab at that. We did take a look at the genders of case authors. We didn't actually include it in the study because we had some challenges identifying certain case authors' genders. Sometimes names don't tell you everything. So we weren't confident that the data was credible enough. But directionally, it looks like men were more likely to choose to write cases about men. They did write cases about women, but it was less frequent. And the reverse was true for women. Women were more likely to write cases about women. Part of this, we think, has to do with women's and men's networks. So women's personal networks tended to include a lot of women and a lot of men. Men's personal networks tended to be, they call it homophily, but basically men's personal networks tended to look more like themselves. And so there were fewer women in men's networks. So if you use your networks to find case leads, it's going to be harder for men to find case leads among women. The answer is we think that women write more cases about women than men do. We don't know that for sure.
Got it. The next two questions are for Violeta. The first one is there a case list of cases available where women are showcased? And does Ivey publish cases based on secondary data?
I'll start with the last one. So do we publish cases on secondary data? Absolutely. Those are our published source cases. The tricky part about those is you got to make sure you're choosing the correct protagonist, and that we don't want to insert female protagonists here just to insert female protagonists, because that's not really moving the needle. So just a caution around secondary data. And if there is no protagonist, then having an analyst or a consultant and keeping it gender-free is appropriate as well. I'd rather that than this sort of creation of a female protagonist. And then for can we find female protagonist cases on the website? This is our shift, and this is our move. As I had mentioned, we have tagged for DEI, and we are making changes to the way that we represent the data on our website, and that will be a part, gender. It will also be race, and thinking about it in the regards to what's available there. So right now with the DEI tagging, we do have gender and race, and we're happy to point you to that direction.
Fantastic. So I think in a sense, you answered the next question, which was, are there any efforts from Ivey to consider gender diversity in general in the case studies published? Absolutely. It is something that we are constantly looking at. It's not just gender. It is an important part, but also race, ability, thinking of all aspects of DEI, and not just, I think often enough people think that, oh, it's got to be a female case, so then it has to be a challenge or a problem that she's facing. Well, it might just be a female protagonist, and she just needs to figure out a balance sheet, something very simple. So also try not to depict women into these problem situations but really just
a full scope of, representation and issues that face DEI.
Thank you. The next question is, would individuals who identify as non-binary also face invisibility in case studies?
I'll take that one if that's okay. The answer is yes. I recently wrote a case that just got accepted by a different publisher. And one of the things I started to do was I asked all of the participants in the case to provide me with their preferred social identity. So, there was one man who introduced himself as a white, gay, can't remember what the other one was, but he chose how he wanted himself represented. Now, this particular case is very much about social identity and positioning, but I'm beginning to believe that it's really important. So, for instance, for race, that if an individual wants their race identified, that it should be identified in the case in some way. That can be done a lot of different ways. It can be done through photographs. It can be done through the text. But I think it's becoming more and more important for people to choose what their identity is and how it's being represented, because it does affect their power and positioning within an organization. And we don't talk about that a lot when we're talking about decision making, but it's there. So I would say that, yes, we need to do more in terms of all marginalized peoples.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So next question is also from Maria Ballesteros Sola. She says, I have noticed that cases with female protagonists usually include a reference about their family. Yes, we discussed this earlier, so that's good. Great question. While you hardly see this information when the protagonist is a man, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm gonna touch really quickly on this, because when I see family involvement with men, it is around succession planning. And I find that is exactly it. Is like, if it's a female, it comes from a supportive environment, where if it's a male and family is involved, it is all about the power and all about succession planning.
And to build on that, one of the interesting things we know from the literature about women in the workplace is women are perceived to be less competent. It's called the mother effect, because they have children, which is a distraction from work. And so it can often unintentionally say, well, she's got two priorities here. And with men, the only case that I saw in our study, now this was several years ago, was a man who was going on parental leave, and he was debating whether to go on parental leave or not. And that was the only case that we saw any reference to a male protagonist's family. That does differ by culture. So a lot of the cases from India that I've seen tend to have a lot more references to families, and it's definitely, at least in the cases, it's definitely men thinking about family-related issues. And you see that far more than you would see in a case based in North America.
Thank you, Colleen. Next question is from Latricia Powell. She says, are women unknowingly sustaining the very stereotypes that oppress them by operating from a mindset shaped by patriarchal programming? Good question. Who wants to take
The answer is yes. We've got a lot of unconscious bias. So there's a test called the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And only 17% of the population do not associate men with the workplace and women with home. And that includes a whole lot of women who do that association. We're not aware of it. I can state for a fact that when I look at some of my earliest cases, I cringe a little bit because I now recognize where I was incorporating that. My advice to anybody who's writing a case is to get a friendly colleague who's aware of these issues to read the case in the teaching note to look for those biases.
Sounds good. Violetta, this question is for you. Somebody wants to understand the requirement for the case competition that says the female leadership issue pertinent to the case study and the learning outcomes. What does that mean?
Okay, so this refers to the specific challenges or the dynamics or themes related to women in leadership that are central to the case study. So how have those issues aligned with the intended learning objectives for the students? So for example, a case might explore how a female executive navigates gender biases in a male-dominant industry, or how her leadership style influences organizational culture. So really the focus of female leadership in the case, but also in the teaching. However, this could be an underlining conversation that also highlights a woman in accounting and making an accounting decision, or one in, let's say, even OB, right, and an HR decision. So it's broad, and it's broad for a reason.
Thank you. And one last question. We're almost out of time, unfortunately. Colleen, thanks so much for this engaging conversation. She says, I have a question related to publishing as a woman, particularly writing women in business. Have you ever encountered any backlash in this area? Also, do top journals actively encourage case submission that focuses on women leaders or gender-related business issues?
Okay, so I have not personally experienced a lot of backlash because I spent the last 18 years at Canada's only women's college. So in fact, the type of research I was doing on women in leadership and case writing about female protagonists was strongly encouraged. My understanding from some of my colleagues in other institutions, depending on your business school and what their priorities are, that may be different. I personally, because of my background, have not. The top case writing journals, Case Research Journal, for example, has had a Women in Leadership special issue, and they've also had a Women in Entrepreneurship or Women in which is another form of leadership special issue. I have never had any difficulty getting published there related to women in leadership issues or diversity issues. The tricky part is that it can become challenging if you have to use secondary information. And it can become challenging if it's a very complex issue, which DEI issues often are, because a lot of this is about implicit bias. So there's no evidence. And so sometimes reviewers kind of push back pretty hard. And the other thing is this type of case can be longer than a lot of publishers would like. So is it perfect? No. But I think that there are definitely places, including Ivey, that are open to this kind of case.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you so much for your insights, for your research, which is very, very relevant still and will continue to be. Thank you to Sashkirat and Crystal for sharing your insights with us as well. And my colleague Violetta, who always does a wonderful job moderating. So we will send you the recording of this session very, very soon. So stay tuned, check your emails, check social media. We will also share some insights from the discussion that you will be able to share, spread the word. And remember that submissions to the case competition open on Sunday, and they will be open for 90 days until August 31st. So we really look forward to seeing your submissions. Thank you so much for your participation, and we'll see you next time.